Box has to be turned off from the tab.
They dressed up as a chicken for Halloween. Did you take a picture of that with the chicken? No, not yet. The chickens are disgusting. I'm gonna peck their eyeball.
Looking for the tab to turn the box off. Yes. Excitement. Electrifying the air. It is a very exciting evening, an exciting event, an exciting time here at Red Ember's Bookstore Coffee House. Make some noise for yourselves for coming out tonight. Make some noise for yourselves. I love it. I am the poet known as Analysis, and on behalf of the entire Red Embers Collective, I welcome you, and I am very happy. We are very happy to see you here this evening, not only because this is going to be a dope-ass event that we're about to get into and hear about this new book, but because it's a very exciting time for Red Embers, because we are now at our new permanent home here in the Waverly neighborhood of Baltimore. You've had a chance to look at it. What do you think? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It really is a whole new look, and it's a whole new time for us, and we are excited about it. In case you didn't know, as you were looking here and enjoying this space, there's more to come, because this building that we are leaning against right here, the one that runs along 32nd Street, will eventually be the bookstore. That'll be a nice new split level space. And so the books will come upstairs and be in that. Right now, they are downstairs, so don't worry. If you say, oh no, they got rid of all the books, don't worry. We got the books. We got all 8,000 of them still ready for you, okay? They're downstairs. They will eventually come upstairs, and the downstairs room will become the Baltimore Free School Classroom. Some of you remember that from our North Avenue location. So I want you to start thinking now in terms of a workshop that you might wish to offer the community. Perhaps your RADLEF organization wants to hold a staff meeting here or a special meeting here. Start thinking now in terms of what you want to do with that free school classroom. And next calendar year, you will be able to do it. So that's very, very exciting. How many of you are visiting any location of Red Embers for the first time? This is the fourth one. How many of you have never been to Red Embers before? A few of you. Fantastic. Well, welcome so much. We're glad to have you. You are now officially fam. You're home. All right, so come on back. There's Wi-Fi. Obviously, there's plenty of food. There are drinks. All right, you should go tap into one and get your work done here. Network, bring people. You will always meet somebody fascinating at Red Embers. You will always meet somebody new and radical hanging out in this space. So definitely tell everybody we are open Wednesdays through Saturdays. Wednesday through Saturday from 8 in the morning to 10 p.m. for the cafe. You want to get that last order in by about 9:15 or so. The bookstore is open from 11 to 7. 11 to 7, and again, that's Wednesday through Saturday. So put the word out, redembers.org, at Red Embers on social media, hashtag Red Embers, hashtag Red Embers events, or any other hashtag you wish to make up. Cool? Speaking of events, I want to make sure everybody goes to redembers.org and hit the event tab, because that is where you're going to find out about all kinds of cool things. We have plenty of cool things coming up, actually. This Saturday will be very interesting. One of Red Embers' extended family, Nani Ferreira Matthews, will be here, along with, coming all the way from Florida to join us, Andrew Zonafeld, speaking about why anarchists don't vote. Why anarchists don't vote. The vote is often upheld as the purest expression of democracy, but what does electing wealthy elites into oppressive governments have to do with democracy anyway? Do anarchists vote? Do they not vote? That's going to be a very interesting conversation. That's this Saturday, November the 5th at 7 p.m. So make sure you get here for that. Next week, this will be really nice. Arise, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution. Christina Heatherton will be here talking about that very, very interesting study in conversation with Red Emma's fam, Christy Thornton. So that's going to be fascinating. Again, that's Arise, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution. That's on Wednesday the 9th at 7 p.m. The very next day at 7, Afterlife, a collective history of loss and redemption in pandemic America. All right. Afterlife is collective history of how Americans experienced, navigated, commemorated, and ignored mass death and loss during the global COVID-19 pandemic, mass uprisings for racial justice, the near presidential coup, and all kinds of madness that we are experiencing during these times. How are they navigated? Carrie Lee Merritt will be here to join us and talk about that. So again, go to redms.org. You see all kinds of things. George Lakey will be here with Dancing with History. Andrea Ritchie with the new joint that she did with Miriam Kaba called No More Police. That's on the 26th. Another dear Red Emma's family member, Nicole Fabricant, I call her Nikki Fab because that's what her social media is, will be here in conversation with Doc Brown, we call him Lawrence Brown, and Shoshana Campbell on December the 3rd. Too much fun to miss, especially on Saturday, November the 12th. I had to save my favorite one for last because on the 12th at 6 p.m., special time, 6 p.m., we will celebrate the 10th anniversary installment of my baby. It's called Red Emma's Mother Earth Poetry Vibe. Red Emma's Mother Earth Poetry Vibe. We started in December of 2012. There are many good mics that have come and gone in Baltimore in those 10 years. We are very fortunate to still be alive and going very, very strong with the DMV's quarterly venue of peace, justice, poetry. So I know there are plenty of poets in the room ready to get on the mic on Saturday the 12th, so you should get here. And even if you're not going to get on the mic, you should get here. All right, and experience the poetic energy, bring somebody. I'll feature that evening coming up from Northern Virginia, the dynamic C. Alexandria Bernard Thomas. And that's going to be a very special night, as I say, 10th anniversary. And that means a lot, not only to me and the Red Emma's Collective, but I would dare say to the DMV poetry scene generally. That's going to be on the 12th at 6 p.m. Cool? How many poets in the room? Stop lying, stop lying. There's a poet in everybody waiting to come out. There's a poet in everybody. I'm gonna look for y'all to get on the open mic list. Special night, all right. Speaking of poetry, poetry does what? It breaks boundaries. It expresses important ideas in different ways. This writer that we have here is Red Emma's fam from the original days, and she breaks boundaries and she expresses things in creative and different ways. Margaret Killjoy is a trans feminine author born and raised in Maryland who has spent her adult life traveling with no fixed home. But in West Virginia right now?
Yep.
Okay, very cool, very cool. A 2015 graduate of Clarion West, Margaret's short fiction has been published by Tor.com, Strange Horizons, Vice's Terraform, Fireside Fiction, and many others. Margaret is the author of A Country of Ghosts, The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion, we have that over here. The Barrow Will Send What It May, we have a copy of that over here. She is also host of 2 podcasts, all right? Live Like the World is Dying, and Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff. I do hope that at some point you talk about those cool podcasts because they sound very interesting. So I definitely am going to have to get into those podcasts myself. This one right here is very interesting. We've got demons, we've got ghouls, we've got, all kinds of shit that I want to get into. This is going to be deep, and we're going to let our special guest take it away. So I need y'all to make some real radical Red Emma's noise for presenting We Won't Be Here Tomorrow and Other Stories. Make some noise for Margaret Killjoy.
Thank y'all. This is, speaking at Red Emma's is like the most like speaking at like my home base, even though I'm never here anymore. But I don't know, I love Red Emma's. I've been coming here since 2004 or something like that, 3 locations ago. I only barely made it to the third location, but I'm glad I've made it to all of the locations. But stop moving so that I don't have to. All right, cool. Like buy a building or something. Like I don't know. But yeah, I don't know. And so it's always an honor to get to come here and do book releases and things here. I'm gonna move this so I feel less awkward. It didn't work. I still feel awkward. And so, yeah, I wrote this book of short stories over the past 7 or 8 years. It's basically most of the short fiction that I've written since I feel like I've been writing at a more professional level. I've been writing short fiction for a very long time. I've been writing longer fiction for a very long time. It started more coming together for me in terms of my own creative power in 2014 or so. And so these are the short stories I've written since then, basically. There's some exceptions. I wrote a Magic the Gathering story that isn't here because I don't own it. But I don't know, I kind of wish it was, whatever. Ask me about that later, and then I'll be embarrassed because I don't know as much about Magic the Gathering as people. I don't know why I led down this trail. And what I'm planning to do is do a reading of one of the shorter pieces from this book, the last story in this book, and then mostly move into question and answer, and then possibly, if time allows, maybe do another short reading. I thought about, and then I'm just not going to do it. One of the stories takes place in Baltimore after a weird, spooky apocalypse with cursed angels and shit. But I'm not going to read that one to you all tonight. You have to read it on your own time, because instead I'm going to read a story that I stole from my father, who's here, and so because my father's also a writer, and so I'm basically retold one of the stories that I grew up with, and so I figured to do that to him and therefore to you all by reading that story here tonight. Can people hear me? Is this an okay distance to the microphone and shit like that? All right, cool. So I'm gonna do a reading, then I'm gonna do question and answer. I don't remember if I got to that part, but that's my plan. I did already get to that part. This story is called The 37 Marble Steps. I grew up near the foothills of Appalachia, and there's something to these forests. The trees themselves aren't old, but the mountains are old. The mountains are old and battered and smoothed over, and what is a forest but the outbursting of life come up from the land? The trees themselves are not old, but the forests are old because these mountains are old. I grew up near the foothills of Appalachia, and I remember when the Blair Witch Project came out, set close to where I lived. It didn't surprise anyone. The movie was a work of fiction, but there's still something to these mountains and these forests. There's still something there, something that the movie drew from. My father told me this story when I was a kid. He told me this story under the boughs and the stars, and it's not something I'll ever forget. The next day, he took me to the place it happened. He took me to the marble steps. There are 37 marble steps in the middle of the forest, far from any road. The steps climb steep and twisted up from a seasonal creek, up to a tiny concrete foundation peppered with stones. There's no house there anymore. There is, however, a crack in the foundation. The crack is narrow and long, and underneath there's nothing. Not soil, not rock, just nothing. You shine your flashlight through that crack and you see nothing. You slide your skinny arm through that crack and you feel nothing. You drop a coin through that crack and you hear nothing. I tried all those things. There was a house on that foundation years ago, years before my father was born, probably before his mother was born, maybe before her mother came over from the old country fleeing persecution. I couldn't tell you when exactly there was a house on that foundation. It doesn't make sense for there to have ever been one, not out where there's no road, not out where whoever built it had to carry marble and concrete on their back or on the backs of animals. I can't tell you why there was a house. I can only tell you that there was one. I can tell you about the woman who lived there, too. I can tell you that she didn't have a name, that she didn't need a name. Names are not for yourself, they're for other people. You live alone in a house in the woods on top of the marble steps, and you don't need a name because no one calls you anything. The people from the nearby town, they just called her the woman who lives in the woods. This woman lived alone, and she was ageless like all women who live alone. She lived only 5 miles or so from the nearby town. That town is gone now, too. It probably had a name, though I don't know it. The woman lived close enough that the people hiking or hunting in the forest saw the smoke from her chimney and saw some of the light in her windows. Sometimes people even saw her herself wandering the forest. They saw her hair pinned up in a bun in the summer and under hats and hoods in the winter. They saw her gaze, alternatively blank and fierce. Sometimes they heard her sing. It went like this. She walked paths through the woods, sometimes down even to the road alongside the town. She had a stick in one hand and a burlap sack in the other. bad man, braise the bones," she sang as she beat bushes with the stick. A good whack, a good thump against the branches. Bugbear, boil the broth." Animals, all kinds of animals, would run out from the bushes and the brambles right into her sack. Rabbits, groundhogs, snakes, possums, raccoons, mice, birds, and lizards. Every creature under the sun and every creature that hides from the sun would run right toward her and into the sack. Once it was good and full, she'd twist the end closed, lift it like it weighed nothing, and beat the bag with the stick until the squirming stopped and the crying stopped and everything inside was dead or willing to pretend. She'd throw that bag over her shoulder and walk away, whistling now instead of singing, that same tune. I know the tune, I could hum it to you, but I don't know how to write it, so maybe that tune will die out one day, and maybe we'll all be the safer when it does. Dogs went missing sometimes around that town. Cats, too, lambs and calves and chickens. Never children. One reason people in the town put up with that woman as long as they did is that whenever a kid went missing, they'd wind up back at home, right in their crib, not crying, the blood of berries tinting their lips. One day, a little girl, not yet 7 years old, got swept away by the river. Surely she'd drowned, the parents thought. The whole town thought. That night, she walked up to her own house wearing a burlap dress, her hair brushed and braided, her belly full. She didn't say a word about what happened, but everyone knew that the lady with a bag and a stick was watching out. It went like that for years, for generations. Was it the same woman? No one could tell. "Bruno, Bruno, bake the bread," she sang. Boatman, baste the bear." A good whack, a good thump, and she had the animals, and off she went on her way. Never said a word to a soul. This was fine, and this was good, and no one in town thought too hard on it. Until one day, it wasn't fine, it wasn't good. People mostly want to let each other alone, and that woman wasn't hurting anyone. A boy came up in that town, and he became a man while he was at school in a nearby city. And when he came back as a man, he decided he wasn't going to be the sort to just let people alone. John was his name, at least as I have it. Big John, they called him, because there's an awful lot of Johns, and this John was the tallest. One day in early March, John was walking home from the mill. The sun was near to set, and the wind with something wild and a little bit of snow was being thrown about here and there. He saw the woman, and he heard the woman, and he saw a cat run into her bag, and he decided enough was enough. He waited until she was far enough distant, and then he followed her off through the woods, up to that seasonal creek. Most people, they took one look at that house on the top of those marble steps, perched down over the gully, and they went right back the way they came. Big John, though, he waited until the woman went into the house, then he climbed up each of those steps himself. Smoke was pouring out the chimney and lamplight flickered through the unshuttered windows, and Big John went up to one of those windows, and he looked inside. The woman was there, and she had the sack over one shoulder, and she went up to the middle of the bare concrete floor, and she tapped her stick 7 times. Tap, 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 tap. She tapped her stick 7 times, and she stepped back and she waited, and a trap door was there where nothing had been. And she reached down and grabbed the iron rung and pulled it up. And Big John heard a wailing, a keening from within. He couldn't describe it better than that in all the years he tried. Inhuman, inanimal, demonic. The woman upended the sack. Animals, including that cat, tumbled out down into the darkness. Soon after, far worse sounds came from that trap door, and the woman smiled and cooed like she was tending a pet, and she closed that trap door. She tapped on it 7 times with her stick. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, 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 tap. The trapdoor was gone. On the wall, hung up with the coats and the cloaks, were animal collars and tags, dozens of them. Big John had seen enough, and he turned to go, but snuck in one last look and saw the woman at her stove singing again, cooking what looked and smelled for all the world like vegetable soup. Big John snuck down those stairs as quietly and as carefully as he could, but as soon as he reached the path by the creek, he ran all the way back to town. 5 miles he ran, and when he showed up at the sheriff's house, he was panting and sweating and pale and just worn out, and his body was just about to give up on him. He knocked on that door. Tap, tap, tap. The sheriff answered. "The woman," he said, "the cats, the dogs." He told the sheriff what he'd seen, and of course the sheriff didn't believe him about the trap door, and he didn't believe him about the vegetable soup, but he believed him about the animal collars. Everyone in town knew that the woman stole pets and livestock, anything with fur or feathers that was small enough to fit into her sack. Everyone knew it, but no one had admitted it, because if they'd admitted it, they would have had to do something. But here was Big John standing at the doorstep of authority, and that authority decided to finally to admit to himself what he already knew. It wasn't yet late, just past dinner, and the sheriff rounded up his posse and headed into the forest with guns and lanterns, ready to find the woman and bring her to justice. Big John, though, he stayed at home. He'd used up all his nerve for that night, maybe for the rest of time. Now, this is where you expect the story to go all wrong, and it will, but it doesn't go wrong the way it might have. The sheriff climbed the 37 steps, his posse following. He showed up at the woman's door, banging with the handle of his revolver on the wood. Bang, bang, bang. The woman answered, and the sheriff arrested her. And the posse tore apart the cabin looking for contraband. They found the dog collars and the cat collars, and that was enough, but they found nothing else besides. Hot barley soup on the stove, flavored strong with garlic and wild onion. No bones, no midden, no trap door, no basement at all. Big John had been seeing things. They marched the woman 5 miles back to the sheriff's office and locked her into the town's one holding cell, and by then it was the middle of the night, and the woman was steel-faced and unbroken. "You have to feed her," the woman said. "Feed who?" the sheriff asked. "Someone has to feed her," the woman said. "Someone must go up there and feed my daughter." "You don't have a daughter," the sheriff said. And that was that, and the woman was sent to the city for trial, and no one thought much about her again, because what is a prison but a place to put those you wish to forget, those who make you uncomfortable? What is a prison but oblivion? A week later, Big John was walking home in the evening out along that road when he heard a terrible thing, a wrenching, a scream of wood and steel and a scream of animal throats and a scream of emptiness and terror. Then nothing happened. Except from then on, children from that town, they weren't returned with berry juice on their lips when they went missing. When children went missing, they stayed missing. And now there's a concrete foundation peppered with stones with a crack in it and nothing on the other side. And people don't camp there much, and people don't build towns there no more. And the forest is old, and no one knows how those marble steps got there, and no one knows much of anything anymore. There's no moral to this, to be sure. I'm not here saying you've got to let the little evils go unaddressed so you don't let out the big evil. I'm not even saying what was in that basement was evil, not for sure. I'm not saying it was right what happened to the woman, and neither am I saying it's okay to steal cats and feed them to monsters. I'm just saying it happened. I'm just telling you about the 37 marble steps and that foundation and that crack that goes off to nowhere. Thank you all. If folks want, I'd be happy to answer any questions either about that story, about this book, about my fiction writing more generally, or about other projects like my podcast or any of that other stuff.
And I think we're going to check D, all of the above, because we definitely want to hear about all of those. I know that there are questions and comments formulating in your mind, so we will ask that you keep your questions pretty truncated and direct, because there's so much to talk about and unpack. So I will come around with the microphone as you are ready. Thank you for that reading. And I guess I'll just start off
Yeah.
by asking you to talk about writing fiction and short stories and what have you in relationship to your nonfiction analysis. I want to remind everybody that We Are Many, which is a very good analysis of the Occupy movement, is sitting over here also, co-edited by none other than Margaret Killjoy, Red Emma's co-founder Kay Khatib, another Red Emma's family member. I don't know if Mike is here tonight. Mike, where are you? There you go. Mike McGuire, all right. Another collective member. So there's all this type of radical energy, and of course the late David Graeber, Ashe. So in terms of your writing process and your goals as far as writing nonfiction and essay and analysis versus when you have it in your head to sit down and say, okay, it's time for a new collection of stories, how you get at that from your particular, from an anarchist framework or from an activism framework, what is the comparison between the two?
Yeah, this is something I put a lot of thought into for a long time. Actually, my first book is me asking this question of a bunch of people. It's a book called Myth Makers and Lawbreakers, Anarchist Writers on Fiction. And it was basically, I had these two interests that seemed disparate to me. I was, a mid-20s, late 20s, like traveling activist, anarchist. And then I also was writing more and more fiction. And I kind of didn't know why. And I mean, the real reason is I just wanted to write stories and fuck it, who cares? But I always had to put everything into this like overarching framework of like, how does this tie into my like larger life goals of, ending the state and capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy and all that shit. And so I went and I found some smart people, and then one asshole TERF who turned out later to be a TERF. Anyway, I went and asked people these questions, and I was like, why, how do these things relate? And people actually had really smart answers, which really helped me. And a lot of it is about, I believe in cultural change as part of the political project. I believe that the ideas of what we move towards are the ideas that we consider possible. And I think that the act of imagining is actually, can be a radical act. It's not enough, but it's not something that we should forget about. And so fiction writing and creating a culture of storytelling, not like holding individual authors up, but instead creating this culture where we envision things and we present them in a fictional or a narrative form, I think is very useful. I think it's very useful because people learn in very different ways from each other. I don't learn as much by reading nonfiction. I do now. I read a lot of history for the podcast that I do, but it took me a long time to become more comfortable with that. I got most of my ideas through conversation, and it's not to say that there weren't nonfiction books involved. My conversation is I say, hey John, explain Deleuze to me, and thanks John. I still don't understand, but I understand enough to name one of my bands after one of the concepts. And so like the oral process of learning information was also very useful to me. But I also think that fiction is a major way that we learn a little bit less like the nuts and bolts of like political theory, but it's where we learn ideas about who we can be as people. Because there tends not to be characters in nonfiction unless you're reading biographies or history. And I think that, and I still stole this from, I think, Alan Moore, one of the people I interviewed in that book, we create the image of, we become the people that we want to be, that we strive to be. And often those ideas come from role models, and sometimes those role models are people in our real lives, and sometimes they're people from fiction. And so I'm really excited to participate in that process that we are all trying to do. I think that cultural change essentially has to come before social change and political change. And I actually think the mess we're in right now is that I think overall, broadly, the left was way better at culture than the right. And then all of a sudden, like, the right was like, wait, hold on, there's, anti-racism is happening, and the trans people are coming out of the closet, and there's gay people everywhere. We have to do something about this. And they suck at culture, so they just went with, like, what they're good at, which is manipulating levers of power that are created by both sides of the Democrat, anyway, whatever. By using the traditional means of power that they already have access to. Because I think cultural change, while it's very important, is a little bit more fragile. And so it's not enough, but I'm glad to be participating in that part as well.
Surrealist imagination, I might
Yeah.
say. I'm looking at Kate as I say that, who knows 1,000 times more about surrealism than I do, but that's what I hear, that dynamic energy, you know, in that description. Questions and comments?
Oh.
Hi, Margaret. Nice to see you.
Yeah. We've never met before. I usually say that as a joke with people I know, but we actually haven't met in person before. Anyway, the pandemics are weird. Please continue. I'm sorry.
Having never met you, as a fellow Sagittarius, I'm curious about the title of this book and how you came to this specific title. If you could just elaborate on it.
Yeah, We Won't Be Here Tomorrow is the name of one of the stories, and it's the name of a story in which like a youth subculture in New Orleans has basically promised some ghouls that they'll all die by the time they're 30. And then everyone goes out and like lives their best life and dies by 30, and then the protagonist turns 30 and is like, whoops, I wasn't supposed to do that, and then has to run away from ghouls, which is totally not a metaphor for anything. And I picked it as the title of it because it's a concept that I like toying with in as many different ways as possible. Like I have an album called Every Breath Our Last, and like I'm pretty into the I have this theory that all poetry is just like people trying new ways to write YOLO. And like I was like in the catacombs below Paris, and my friend was like translating the poetry carved into the wall, and it was like all this like, I don't know what century, 16th century or something, French poetry about like, hold on to the flowers for they will die in your hands or whatever. And I'm like, oh, I'm really into all this shit. As you're, in a mountain of skull. That was a very, very literal version of it, but that's a thing that I find really beautiful and try to evoke, even though it's also intended as a tension, right? Because like even that story is like someone who's like supposed to die by the time they're 30, and then they turn 30, and I think that's great too. I also think everyone should live as long as they can, because other people want us to not, and fuck them.
All poetry is finding another way to write YOLO. I might use that. You might hear that again.
Hello.
Hi.
This is specifically about the 37-step story.
Uh-huh.
I was curious to know, how did you find such a distinct balance between traditional Appalachian folktale storytelling and modern voice, which you did an excellent job with, by the way.
Oh.
Amazing.
Thank you. I kind of almost don't know the answer to that. I think the Appalachian folk tale stuff comes from, again, I ripped that story off my father, and I hadn't heard it in like 20-some years before I wrote it down, but the way that storytelling was like a part of my childhood, right? And so I like consciously used some of the things with like a thump and a whack and stuff like that. But it always has to get tied to the style that I prefer. I'm more comfortable writing in. Like I don't actually think, in a lot of ways, this is not a very good example story of the collection. The themes are absolutely right, but this is a little bit more like a kid's story version of whereas the rest of the stuff might be more like YA or like teen level. I don't tend to write a ton of really horrific stuff, but I don't know. I basically just took a little bit of that and then paired it with the voice that I most comfortably write in. But thank you, I really appreciate that. That makes me happy.
Did I see another hand? Writing process question. Full-length novel, full-length story versus short stories. Do you approach them differently? Do you find one more comfortable than the other? I'm thinking in terms of Land Will Slaughter the Lion versus this collection, and how do you approach them differently?
So I write really short. The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion is a novella, and even like A Country of Ghosts, when I finished it, I was like, I finished my first novel, and I like put it out. And then I later got an agent, and my agent was like, how long is that book? And I was like, 50,000 words. He was like, call it a novella from now on, so that we, like, when you sell your first novel, we can like get better money out of it, you know? And I was like, all right, great, my novella. And so now I usually refer to it as my book. You know, A Country of Ghosts is my book, or my anarchist utopian book. And so I tend to write short. And so in a lot of ways, writing short stories is like the most natural thing for me. I think that basically I have like self-diagnosed ADHD, and I'm perfectly comfortable with it, in that I like constantly want to be doing new and different things. And so sometimes I struggle with longer form stuff. The longest stuff I've ever actually written is, well, I have an unpublished YA that will hopefully eventually come out sometime next year or the year after or something. And then I used to ghostwrite romance novels. And so that was how I learned how to write longer things, was because I had to eat, and they had given me an amount of money in exchange for me doing a certain amount of work. It's this weird system. It seems to be pervasive. And I'm like, well, what if I just want to eat and I don't want to write the romance novel? But that wasn't actually an option. But the way that I do from a writing process point of view is very different. I outline more and more as I become more comfortable as a writer. When I first started, I usually did what we'd call pantsing, like writing by the seat of your pants. Sometimes people want to call it writing by the headlights instead. I think it's funnier to say pants. And I used to do that more, but I would run into more dead ends because you would take a story in a direction and you have to back now I'm using the car analogy again. You have to like back it out of the weird alley that you drove it into. And so outlining really helps with that. But outlining didn't used to be fun, and it kind of stripped away some of the fun of writing and the exploratory process of writing. But interestingly, as I become more comfortable of a writer, I actually have this almost problem where I more successfully write what I set out to write. So there's actually less exploration involved. And so now I outline more. And when I write longer work, I'm also more prone to outlining, whereas some of the stories in this, I just wrote in a sprint and was like, fuck it. Like one time, one of the stories in here, The Bones of Children, is a Lovecraft mythos story. And basically what happened is someone was putting together a Lovecraft book, and then like one of the people who was going to have a short story in it got, I guess you could say, Me Too'd out of the book. They were uninvited from the book, and they were like, who do we know who can write a story really quickly, who doesn't sexually assault people? So I passed that low bar. And this is not an advocacy of this method at all, but I got drunk and I wrote the whole thing in one day, and then I sent it. There was like several prominent black characters, and I sent it to someone for a sensitivity reading, and got back their notes, and I made the edits, all in the same day while drunk. Turned it in. This is where I really went wrong. I turned it in while drunk. And then the next day I did a read through, and I found all these typos. And I wrote the editor, and I was like, I'm so sorry. And he was like, this is the cleanest manuscript we got for this book. And I was like, well, I'm extra sorry now. And so sometimes I'll write in a sprint, but most of the time I'll outline. That is my long way of saying that.
That leads to another writing process question, but you half answered it with the drunk episode. I may come back to it.
I was going to ask, have you ever written something that kind of surprised you how it turned out, even though you were the one that made it turn out that way, except it's not really you? It seems like it's you, but it could not necessarily be.
Yeah. The first time it happened to me really noticeably, the way that it like really sits in my memory of the time that it happened was the first novella I ever wrote, which is like I self-published as a zine, and I'm not going to tell you all the name of it. And the protagonist was like largely a self-insert character, and he had this problem where he's like being bullied or whatever, and he's like, oh, and he's like 15. He's like, oh, he's gonna go stand up to his bully. And I'm like, yeah, and there's in the outline, he's like, and then he punches the bully, you know, and he goes up, and the character, I'm like, yeah, now punch him. And the character's like, man, I just really wish you wouldn't treat me like that. It sucks. Like, why do you treat me like, and then like walks away. And then I'm like, why'd you do that? That's not what I told you to do. And it was this epiphany where I was like, oh, you know, the way that I view characters and story is you create these little wind-up toys, and you wind them up, and then you put them into the setting, and the initial thing are what you control, and then they do the stuff. And I didn't yet know that. I thought I could make the character do something that wasn't in that character's. Yeah. And so it happens every now and then from then on, but the other thing that happens is like I'll start writing these stories where I'll be like, and then you know what, at the end she's gonna dump her boyfriend because fuck that guy, and then like after everything that she goes through, she's like, no, I'm gonna give him another chance, and I'm like, what? And then like a year later, I'll be like, yeah, he kind of actually wasn't that bad. All right, like I was being too hard on him. It's the story. Wait, I want to know later if you ever read it. We Will Destroy the Future. In the original version, she dumps her boyfriend. Spoiler.
So my first question was going to be about how apocalypse seems to be thematic through your fiction and nonfiction work. However, not last question, but the one before, how do I pick up Margaret Killjoy romance novels?
I am legally obliged to not answer this question. Talk to me later. I can answer the apocalypse question if you want. Wait, was that a question or is it just the apocalypse?
It is your question because I've seen your nonfiction and your fiction work. Apocalypse seems to feature heavily. I don't see a lot of Star Trek, and then the anarchist. Hackers realized they were wrong.
Right.
And the anarchists came in and come on guys, we'll get together, work together.
Yeah.
You don't do that a lot.
Yeah. Maria? No. I mean, it's interesting because one of the stories that I have outlined and a little bit written is a post-apocalyptic thing that is about horizontal decision making and different pluralistic groups coming together and facing that and creating a better society out of that. But I bit off not more than I could chew, but it's gonna take me a minute, right? But I admit that I think that the task that lays in front of us is to accept that the status quo could continue, but that does not seem like the most likely outcome from the current environment that we're in, from a bunch of different axes. And I think it behooves all of us to look as soberly as we can and say, well, it's possible that we can fix this. It's possible that it'll fix itself. It's possible that there's nothing that can be done and we will all die. And it's possible that there's nothing that will be done and we can try and survive. And with those four ideas, I think we need to hold all of them as possibilities and we need to make contingencies and just take it seriously that how do we want to face, because the world is always ending and it has ended for different people in different times in different ways. How do we want to face that? And I hope the answer is collectively. And so the primary thrust of my work in a lot of ways is just I want people to have water filters at home, and but I also want people to have horizontal decision-making models in mind so that when people are looking around for answers in the wake of crisis, whether that crisis is as big as a zombie apocalypse or as small as the crises that are happening constantly, that we can look around and say well, I have ideas about how we can come up with answers. Rather than someone coming in and stepping in and being I have the answers. Even as an anarchist, I shouldn't step in and be yes, well, what we need is a free association of cooperative autonomous groups for the purpose of mutual aid. Please sign up for my federation or whatever, right? And that's fine and good, and I like cooperative autonomous groups working together for mutual aid, and I have no problem with federations. But I don't want us to show up with answers. I want us to show up with decision-making tools with which to reach answers collectively. And so that's my main goal in life right now, is to do that as much as I can with whatever means that I have available to me. Thanks.
Hello, thank you so much. That story was really creepy that you read. Have you ever had any supernatural or ghost experiences yourself?
So I used to absolutely believe in ghosts, and now I absolutely believe in sleep paralysis. And that the jury is out about ghosts, because I have experienced a lot of things. I experienced sleep paralysis, which is, for anyone who's blessed enough to not know what that means, I wake up, my body is still chemically paralyzed from sleep, and I'm still dreaming and therefore hallucinating. And that almost always incites a sort of fear. And I believe that 95% of ghost stories throughout history can be attributed to this. The first time I knew I was seeing a ghost, I was very aware of the ghost, and I was so paralyzed I couldn't move, And then basically, I think that happens more when I sleep on my back. and it happens more when I sleep in places that are uncomfortable and I need to be half awake, like squatting, where I don't have, I can't sleep on my side on the hardwood floor because I don't have enough padding, and I am waiting for the cops to come. And so I would always have these nightmares about demons and devils and cops, but I repeat myself. And so that was a big part of my understanding of sort of supernatural experiences. And then but it didn't suddenly like make me like a full diehard materialist where like nothing spooky is ever real. But what it made me realize is the stuff that I find really spooky and interesting is stuff that instead puts me while awake in different headspaces. And so I spent a lot of time in the woods alone, just because I lived in the woods alone. Well, I guess I still do live in the woods alone. And so I have a lot of things that don't track to the materialist reality or whatever, right, entirely. But it's not because I like saw a ghost. It's more like this overwhelming sense of eeriness envelops me, and it allows me to think in ways that I would not otherwise have been able to think. And it very much helps my creative process. It doesn't always help my sense of being safe. So yeah, that's where I'm at. I really care about the spooky and supernatural, but I don't. The other thing that I do is that I very consciously, like I lived in this barn in this field at the end of a gravel road and whatever, and I lived by myself in this barn, and there was a guest room in the barn, and someone was like, oh, some of the guests have been complaining about the ghosts in the barn. And I was like, there's no ghosts in the barn. And people were like, no, all these people. I was like, they had sleep paralysis. And they're like, you're being really dismissive of their concerns. I was like, I live here alone. There's no ghosts in the barn because I am not allowing there to be ghosts in the barn. That is not allowed within my worldview. If you live alone, and then I like lived alone in a van and I stopped watching horror movies because I was like, well, that's not gonna work for me. I wanna keep sleeping where these random places I like sleeping. So very complicated feelings about horror and all that.
I do not envy at all your sleep paralysis and fighting that, but you are the second artist in the past couple of years that I've heard describe going through that and who has used that as impetus to generate art. There's a filmmaker here in Baltimore by the name of Maceo Tendai of Iconic Visions with the K. And shameless plug here, there's a movie short coming out soon called Paralysis.
Oh, cool.
Which actually jumps off of his experience with sleep paralysis, but it deals with police brutality. Oh, here's the shameless plug part, starring myself and 3 other poets. But again, the way something which to me just sounds horrifying can generate art in certain ways and be used to teach certain lessons or express artistically certain things. It's a fascinating thing.
So I know that when you were younger, you were, I guess, an eco-warrior. I'm not sure the best term. So now that you're living alone in the forest, right, and we just heard a story, 37 steps. Would you say 37 steps is at all aspirational for your future self?
So I actually moved a half step away from the witch in the woods stereotype. I spent the beginning of COVID living in this black tiny A-frame that I had built on my friend's property in North Carolina, and it was just literally just like a witch house in the woods. And I loved it aesthetically, and I did not love it materially for like level of mold and like ability to control moisture in a 12 by 12 A-frame without power and things. And so I feel like I like more dove into that kind of archetype for myself. Because also like, I think when shit's really hard, you romanticize your life. Because otherwise you're just fucked. You're like, well, I might as well like scrape some beauty out of this weird thing I'm doing. And when COVID hit, I was like suddenly in that cabin as like, I had intended as a bedroom, and then suddenly it was my everything room. And I was like scrambling to get running water and scrambling to get solar and all of this stuff. And so I romanticized that life a great deal. And some of the things I used was the sort of witch in the woods archetype to sort of get myself through that. And I feel no shame for doing that. And I feel like I learned a lot from it. But now I have like an on-grid house that's more like, there's like some neighbors I can see. I don't know whether they could hear me if I shouted or not. I haven't tested this. But, I've always been sort of afraid of becoming like a full hermit, honestly, because it's not actually what I truly desire for myself, because that's the danger when you start romanticizing the worst aspect or the hardest aspects of your life. It's really easy to then be like, that's who I am. I'm this figure that I've created. Like, no, we're all really complicated, and running water rules. And also from any like prepping survival, like all this like off-grid fucking prepping, that's fucking nonsense. Like a deep freezer with a battery backup, way better. And like the ability to like have multiple of your friends come over who have like different needs and things like that, way better. Yeah.
Hi. I got super attached to your characters in A Country of Ghosts and was wondering if you were potentially writing a sequel.
So before this tour, I would have answered that I might write a prequel, but I would be unlikely to write a sequel. But I've gotten that enough, because I haven't really interacted with like people who've read my work in a very long time until I went on this tour. And now that people are like, no, but I really like these people, like, I'm like, well, I do too. So maybe. But I know what the conflict would be and the ideas that I want to get across in a sequel. I mean, a prequel that would mostly take place in, I think it's Veronia, the next country over, where there had been a failed revolution and everyone flees. I kind of want to write that failed revolution. But it's like, if the tension in the sequel would probably be like, well, how do we figure our shit out so that we can have coffee and stuff? For anyone who has no idea what I'm talking about, I wrote this anarchist utopian book called A Country of Ghosts that explores like what a society might look like and they're being invaded by a colonial power and shit. But they like sort of defeat that, and then, you know, and then one of the main pieces of feedback I got is that they hadn't really figured out their shit enough to do international trade, so there's certain things they don't have access to. So I'm like, ooh, I could write a bureaucracy novel, but I don't know, that might not play to my strengths.
There's also, there's romance in there.
That's true, yeah. Ah, all right. Oh, polydrama. I should write polydrama. Okay.
Hey, how's it going? So I've been trying to figure out how to like frame my question, so we're in this context of, you know, ecological collapse and ascendant fascism and all this other stuff, and you know, Camus is very popular with a lot of anarchists, you know, Myth of Sisyphus, all that stuff, you know, rolling bullet uphill, falls, all that stuff. I was talking with another guy. I'm in the electricians union, so we're like always like trying to like fight against all these chuds in the union. And so we were talking about Camus, and basically the problem is like, okay, we have this myth, and this is related to the point you had made about like the role of like fictional characters and, you know, like versus like biographies and stuff like this. And it's like, you know, the image of Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill is like obviously this super powerful thing. But at the same time, like, it's not real. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So like on the other hand, like why not say, you know, like a Derudi or something, you know what I mean? Like, and then, okay, so that's the first part. And then the second way I've been trying to think about it is like, you know, there's the one writer, I think it's pronounced like Georges Sorel, who's like he's like turn of the century, 19th and the 20th century, popular with like basically syndicalists and Marxists, and I guess even eventually fascists, but he wrote about like, you know, the role of the myth, and, you know, how like anarchists were like, you know, sort of, they had this beautiful myth of like the great general strike and all this other stuff. So okay, that's. Can
you hold the mic closer to your face?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So yeah, there's, you know, talk about this, you know, the role of this myth and, you know, unifying these, you know, radical movements, and then again on the other hand of it, I remember at some point there was I was watching a lecture from Chomsky, who we all have our opinions about, but someone asked him about, you know, how to persuade people and do all this stuff, and he said something like, you know, we shouldn't try to persuade, we should try to, like, you know, come to things as level-headed as possible. And so I feel like these are both kind of like the same problem. But as someone who, you know, has lived this lifestyle and, you know, has, you know, produced this work, like what is, I guess this is one of those things that doesn't really have an answer, but, you know, I guess I hope you could talk more about that, that tension between something that may not be even attainable, but is nonetheless aspirational versus, real people who lived and fought these struggles and failed, succeeded. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's all I got.
Yeah, no, so I guess like my understanding of it would be like almost the difference between an archetype and mythology versus like stories from history or stories of like actual people that are accomplishing things or not. I like a lot of stuff, I kind of want to like both and that kind of thing. I think that they have their advantages. If we're talking about the danger of the witch in the woods archetype, for example, is that you could fall into it and believe that that's what's happening. And you could also fall into these stereotypes that we have about, like tragic heroes and things like that that we might want to fulfill. And okay, to use as an example of where this can go wrong, at least as I understand it, there was this anarchist revolution in Spain in 1936 to 1939. And one of the problems that they had, even though they were like millions strong, they were the strongest leftist force in Spain. One of the problems, at least to some of the historians I've talked to, is that the anarchists had such a martyr complex that they would like run at machine guns and just be like, hooray, we'll die for anarchy, right? And I'm like, well, that's not my plan. like that's my fallback plan, and it's an all right fallback plan. And so I think there is a danger in turning ourselves into pure figures, right? There's a lot of dangers, and one of them is that you could run a machine gun nest. But I still think that there is when I think of the beauty of history and why history matters, which isn't a phrase I thought I would hear myself say 20 years ago, because I was very like, all that matters is right now and getting stuff done, and we don't care what the historical people did. But the reason it matters to me now is for a couple things. One is that it's basically like science experiments we've been running over and over again of like, what happens if we try to fight oppression this way? And then like, oh, well, that worked, or this didn't work, or these are the parts that worked. And then the other thing is that I think history is really interesting because when you see someone throwing a ball, I hate making sports analogies because I don't understand what I'm saying, but the pitcher, they like throw the ball at the batter, right? And you're not just looking at where the ball is, but you're looking at the overall trajectory, and that involves knowing where it came from and seeing the forces that started it. And so I think that to successfully fight capitalism, it is very useful to see how capitalism grew up. And I think it is also very useful to see the crucible from which the modern, at least Western leftist forces were forged. And those were all real people. And so I think there is some beauty to be found in those real people. And in many ways, I think they make better heroes in that it's easier to see how flawed they are. And I think that it is a perfect hero is even more dangerous than a flawed hero, I think. Because, I don't know, we should all be like, oh, that guy was cool, but don't ask his opinion about gay people. Oh, fuck. On the other hand, some of them were all really good about that shit. I don't know, that only kind of half answers it, but I think that both are useful and interesting. And also, okay, but then there's like a third category. There's this thing that I've seen done really well in punk rock, and I think it's true in other subcultures, where we're like all these like mythical figures to each other. You're like, oh yeah, like Dumpster Susan, like everyone knows about Dumpster Susan, it's like someone in Philly who dumpstered a bunch of potatoes once or something, I don't know, and we can hold each other up as these like amazing figures, and that also has some dangers, but we can kind of like, I think we can do really beautiful things with each other when we do that kind of thing, instead of just like looking back at dead people, or imagining, God, it's like the opposite of Instagram, where you have to like, Instagram is this machine for self-doubt, where like none of us are doing as amazing stuff as our friends. It's like more fun when you're the one, like, because if Dumpster Susan went around being like, check out these potatoes I just got, I'm pretty fucking cool, am I right? You're like, fuck you, I don't care about your 40,000 Twitter followers or whatever, But when like Crowbar Joe is like, hell yeah, have you met Susan? You know, then you're like, fuck yeah, the fucking potatoes, right? And Susan's over in the corner like, fuck, you're talking about fucking. I'm multi-dimensional. I know I named myself Dumpster, but still, you know. Yeah, that's what I got.
Let's take two more. I believe we had these last two questions.
To piggyback off of that a little bit, how do you, when you're looking forward to new episodes of Cool People, how do you find those people? What is your process? Because everyone so far has been amazing, and almost no one I've actually heard of before, including some of her relatives, which we found out because of your episode. So just curious how you go through that process.
Yeah, okay, so the question about how I find who I cover on Cool People who did cool stuff, it's messy. One of my least favorite things are like false starts where I'm like, I'm gonna cover this story, and I'm like, oh no, I don't wanna cover them after all. You know, that happens every now and then. And usually it starts with like, I mean, I front load a lot of the anarchist stuff because it's what I know. But it's not what I'm trying to be like, this is the Anarchist History Podcast, even though at the moment there's about half the content. I'm aiming to get that down to about a quarter or so of it. But those are the stories that have been floating around the movement I've been part of. And so that's where a lot of it comes from. And a lot of it comes from friends, and basically sometimes I'll even be like, no, like tell me who I should cover, because like, you know, I have this like long scrap list that every week I like look at the scrap list and then figure out which books I can actually get. And then actually more than the problem of finding the cool people, it's finding the historians who don't suck. Because I'll get like halfway through and I'll be like, oh, this is lies. Like, or, oh, I can see the propaganda angle that this historian is trying to paint this person as good or bad in a way that doesn't really, you know, work. And so usually what I have to do is like cross-reference multiple books on a given person. Sometimes it's hard when there's like only one book about a person. And, you know, and so so I try to do, it's the people I can find enough about is kind of where it's at. And then the ones that I love the most are when I get to do ensemble casts and like take the event and then find the people who, or some of the people who made that event happen, because that's when I find you get the 18 amazing people who did all this stuff, you know, and they all have like their own backstories and lives, and that's the shit I get excited about. So I guess I start each one being like, oh, I'm gonna cover this. And then somewhere around like day 2 or 3 is when I find the moment where I want to call my partner and be like, holy shit, did you know that there's one person, they use this to poison this person? And then, you know, 'cause I do talk about things other than murder, but, you know, and that's when and then the thing that gets the saddest is when I start reading it, I never quite have that moment. And so those don't end up being episodes if I can't find that moment where it clicks. Yeah.
Did I see your last question? Or, I mean, that would be a fun way to end it right there. Last question right here, and then we'll make a couple closing house announcements.
I guess apropos, I wanted to hear about your experiences deciding when a story's done.
Well, like a short story?
A short story, novella, maybe a novel.
I have this problem where, to just out myself at the worst part of my craft is I sometimes rush the endings because I'm already like, yeah, but what's next? And that's not the best move. And sometimes what I have to do is finish a thing and then like kind of sit on it and then go back, and it's less like I have to do a second draft, and it's more like I have to do a second draft of like the last chapter, which might actually need to be the last 3 chapters in order to like let things breathe. But I feel like I usually, there's this kind of like, when you finish a scene or a book or a story or whatever, there's like a landing, right? And I really enjoy the like landings before a scene break in a story where you like kind of tie it up, and then, you know, sometimes they like, someone says something real funny or whatever and quirky, and everyone's like, aha, that vulture always saying the quirky thing, you know? And so learning how to do that on the like larger scale with a book, I don't know, it's usually kind of a feeling. You kind of like, oh, I'm winding down and now I'm gonna like draw it to a close in a way that like feels closed and dramatic. It's like when you play music and you go back to the root note. You're like, and you play the thing and you play the seventh leading into it or whatever, and then you're like, and there, the final chord of it. But the thing I had to do with my novellas, which people have been very upset, because there's 2 in this series, the Danielle Cain series, and the reason there's 2 is because I had written 1 and I wanted them to buy like 5, and so I ended it on this cliffhanger, or I ended it on this like, and then we're off to see the world, and it worked, but then they only bought 2, and so I was like, I bet I can do this again, and so then I ended the second one with like, and now the magic feds are coming, end of story, and it didn't work that time. They didn't buy more books, and so now I'm like, but I possibly found another publisher to pick up the Danielle Cain series, and so I feel kind of bad because I left readers with this like specific thing where like, yeah, no, I intentionally left you wanting more because I wanted the editor to want more, but it turns out they mostly look at sales, which they didn't have until the book had been out for a while. And then just to tell you too much about all this stuff, like most in mainstream fiction publishing, books have they might have a long tail, but they start with a big amount of sales and they drop off. And not because like I'm particularly amazing or something, but so specifically with the Danielle Cain books, they started off lower than a lot of the other books and then kind of went up in sales. And that it financially does work out, but it doesn't work out like kind of algorithmically in terms of the decisions that people make about like how many of this is sold or whatever. And so that's my like, I swear it's good enough to have more books, which is not what you asked me at all. And with that, how do I end this to leave you wanting more? I'm not sure. I'll leave it with this question. That's what I got.
How do we find your music, Margaret?
Oh, my music. Oh God, I have too many bands. My main band is this atmospheric black metal. It's a feminist atmospheric black metal band because metal loves having too many adjectives, called Feminazgul, and you can find it at feminazgul.bandcamp.com, or you can find it at, our vinyl is put out by Tridroid Records, and then Prosthetic just picked us up for our next album, so you can find it through Prosthetic Records in the future. Nomadic War Machine is my Delusian named project that is a dark pop project you can find on Bandcamp, and then The Lathe is my electropop project, and Ulcerith was my anti-fascist neo-folk band, and then I'm missing, Vulgarite was my one-woman doom metal band that was based on the idea of, can I do an entire EP with words from William Blake and no guitars, and have it be doom metal? And I think the answer you will find is yes. Those are some of my bands. I'm probably forgetting some.
Just on general principle, I'm going to find that last one, that
Right,
William Blake in the key of E metal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that must be investigated. I'm going to have to research that. A couple quick announcements and reminders before we give up another big round of applause. Remember that the book is right here. All right, we won't be here tomorrow, so make sure that you go over and get that, as well as some of the other books from Margaret that are there. Any of the books that you see on right here are for sale. The bookstore is closed, unless there are enough of you that come and whisper sweet radical things into my ear and say, analysis, the hell you mean the bookstore is closed? We came all the way here to buy books. The hell are you talking about the books? Open the damn store. If there are enough of you that whisper these sweet nothings into my ear, then the bookstore might magically open for 15 minutes. We will see. But only if there are enough of you that do that. The restaurant is open. You want to go ahead and place your order so that you have plenty of time to sit and enjoy. Definitely get the book bringing up so that Margaret can sign and that you can introduce yourself and that you can just chat very briefly with her, because we know there'll be a big line of folk that want to talk with Margaret. Again, redemmas.org, go to the events tab so that you see all of the wonderful things, like that wonderful poetry event on November the 12th, Saturday, November 12th, at 6 p.m., Red Emma's Mother Earth Poetry Vibe, because YOLO. I'm sorry, that means you only live, if you're my age or older, you might be like, the hell is YOLO? You only live Once, right? Yeah. You only.
Probably.
I only learned like last year or the year before last what it meant. All right.
It's
Some of
already
us
over.
Is it past? It's
Yeah,
all-
I
okay.
think so. I'm old too, though, so
I don't
I'm
know.
not
So
sure.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know these things, but anyway.
Yeah,
People
yeah.
just say, damn, I missed it already. I'm late behind. I stay behind. I stay behind. Thank you. This has been so much fun.